Deaf in America by Carol Padden and Tom Humphreys. Presentation by Tabitha Parrish. What I liked about the writers is that they themselves were actually deaf. So it was written from the perspective of people who knew what they were talking about. They grew up in the culture and they had personal experiences. So it wasn't just like an overall analysis from a hearing person. Like if I were to write a book about growing up deaf in America, it wouldn't make any sense and it would be all like researched when they actually like understand what's going on. Because there are a lot of books that are written by hearing people about deafness and deaf culture and struggles, I guess, that they don't really understand themselves. So I thought that it was really nice to have actual deaf people write the book. So this wasn't like one of those books that's like normal and has like storylines. It was like a non-fictional, educational sort of deal. That wasn't a word, non-fictional, but it was like learning, and there were a couple stories in the beginning in the chapter learning to be deaf, but it wasn't like a whole storyline book. That was a mistake. I won't do that again. But my favorite story that I enjoyed reading was Joe's, and it was about him growing up in a deaf family, but he himself was hearing, and he didn't even realize he was hearing until he was 8 because he just didn't see anything different. And it talked about how he grew up in the deaf culture and the deaf community, and when he started going to school and started socializing with hearing people, he realized that he was different, but he was also like them. And it was this whole thing about him being like stuck because he was part of the deaf community as a CODA, child of deaf adults, but he also wasn't because he wasn't deaf, but he wanted to be part of the hearing community, but he also felt so different because he grew up in such a different environment. And it had like all this information after it and other people's stories, and his story was just like the best, and I enjoyed it. And I didn't even realize, but I read like a quarter of the book, or like, I don't know, 3/4, I don't know. It was a lot of the book that I read, and I'm not a reader because I have like reading problems and it's not fun most of the time, but I read so much when I was reading his story, so yeah, I liked it the most. I would recommend this book to anybody interested in learning about deaf culture. I feel like it's a good gateway onto other books and other knowledge, I guess, and it's a topic that hearing people don't really think about a lot, so it's very nice to, as reading it for like your beginning knowledge, I guess, from a deaf person's standpoint and not from like an overall medical perspective. The characters were interesting because they all had such different stories and they were told in really vivid ways that you could picture everything. I felt like I was right there, like there was imagery, it was really nice. And there were like so many, in the beginning, there were so many different stories about different deaf people, hearing people, but it was all circled around the deaf community, but it wasn't just like a telling about a deaf person who grew up in a deaf family. There were like different circumstances and different like personal stories, and I thought that that was really nice. I would definitely read another book by either one of the authors. I think that it was just such a like clean and clear writing style. It was so nice and so easy to read. They wrote it so that anybody could read it, including people whose first language isn't English, and I thought that that was really helpful because I'm a horrible reader and I felt like I was reading a children's book. Not like it was like dumb. Well, children's books aren't dumb. No offense to children. But like, I felt like I was reading something super easy, but it was like the knowledge of reading a thesaurus. So I don't think a thesaurus is like a big book, but what is it? It's a synonym book, right? I'm sorry. I probably just deducted myself 25 points, but it was really easy to read and I really liked the authors. When I first started reading this book, I thought that it was going to be one of those boring history books about ASL, which I've read in the past. Not that ASL is boring, because I love reading about it, it's so enjoyable, but like some of them are really dry and just make you not want to learn anymore, and this made me want to learn. Like, I was actually into like history and education, and that was exciting, and the book just really shocked me because like from the outside, I mean, it's a pretty cover, but you just think that it's just going to be like this educational thing, and even though it is educational, it's like exciting and you want to just keep reading it. If I wrote this book, I definitely would have included a lot more stories. It was my favorite part about reading it because you would read somebody's story and they were all different, and then it would have information about what they were saying and facts, I guess, and like history, and that was cool, and it made you want to like learn about it. But then as it went on, it felt like it was just facts and they were just like throwing information at you. It was still a good book, but like that part was kind of a bit annoying. This book really made me realize how important communication is and how privileged and lucky we are as hearing people to grow up in a society where it's just normal to communicate with the English language or Spanish language or whatever language. But there's so many deaf children whose parents don't learn to sign and kind of try to teach them to lip read, but they never have a real communication. And by the time they go to school, you know, maybe they'll learn sign from their peers, but they don't really get to communicate with their family, and that's just horrifying. The only thing that I didn't like about this book is that it was a little bit all over the place. I mean, I love how easy it was to read, but I feel like it was just a lot of information and it was kind of jumbled up. Like, it would have been a little bit nicer if they had different chapters for different topics instead of putting it all next to each other. Still a really good book, but it was just a little bit confusing at times. This book really made me think about how different deaf culture is from hearing, and honestly how much we as a society could learn from the deaf community. Hearing people don't really realize this, but we only really care about ourselves. We focus on personal success. It's every man for himself. Whereas in the deaf community, everyone looks out for one another. It's just very interesting to learn about how different the two cultures are.